Hello everyone, Detective Frost here. Welcome back to the True Crime series, The Cold Files. File number 04D, The Woman with No Name. On a cold November morning in 1970, a father and his two daughters walked through Isdal, a quiet valley outside Bergen, Norway. The landscape was steep, empty, and still, the kind of place where sound seems to disappear into the rock. What they found there would begin one of Europe's most enduring mysteries, a woman lying alone in a remote part of the valley, with no name anyone could verify. She would later become known only as the Isdal Woman. At first, it might have looked like a lonely death in a harsh place. But almost immediately, something about the scene felt wrong. The woman carried no papers that could identify her. The labels had been removed from her clothes. Several belongings that should have made her life easier to trace seemed carefully stripped of meaning. It was as if someone had tried to erase not only where she had been, but who she had been. Then, days later, investigators opened two suitcases left at Bergen railway station. Inside were details that made the case even harder to understand. Wigs, money from several countries, glasses with fingerprints, and a notebook filled with coded entries. The woman had stayed in hotels, often paid in cash, and used different names as she moved through Norway and beyond. People who remembered her described her as elegant, composed, and alert, someone who seemed present in the room, but never fully reachable. This was Europe during the Cold War, and Norway was not just a quiet country on the edge of the map. It was a NATO nation, close to Soviet territory, with strategic importance far beyond its peaceful image. So who was this woman? A traveler hiding from something? A person caught in circumstances no one could see? Or someone whose identity had been deliberately buried? The case did not begin with a name. It began with a discovery in a valley, and a silence no one could explain. On November 29, 1970, the discovery in Isdal was reported to the police, and officers made their way into the valley. At first, the situation could have been understood in the simplest possible way. A woman had died alone in a remote area outside Bergen. There was no immediate public identity, no family standing nearby, no obvious explanation waiting at the edge of the path. But that simple reading did not last. The first problem was identification. The woman had no passport, no driver's license, no papers that clearly said who she was. In most unidentified body cases, investigators look for one missing thing: a name. Here, it felt as if the name had been deliberately erased. The second problem was even more unsettling. Labels had been removed from her clothing and from several personal items. These were not grand clues. They were small, quiet details, the kind investigators might normally use to trace a shop, a country, a maker, or a purchase. But here, those ordinary paths had been cut off. It did not prove who had done it. It did not prove why, but it suggested that someone, at some point, had wanted her belongings to say as little as possible. Police began with the most human question: who was she? They checked missing persons reports. They looked for someone whose age, appearance, and circumstances might match the woman in the valley. But no clear report led them to a family, a home, or a real name. The woman had appeared in death the same way she seemed to have moved through life in the weeks before it. Visible, but difficult to hold on to. Then the investigation shifted. A few days after the discovery, two suitcases were found at Bergen railway station. They would become some of the most important objects in the entire case. Inside them were personal belongings, clothing, wigs, cosmetics, money from several countries, and a pair of glasses. According to reports, fingerprints on the glasses matched the woman found in Isdal. Now the case no longer looked like only a death in a lonely valley. It looked like the end point of a journey. And in the luggage, investigators found one object that gave the mystery a strange new shape: a notebook filled with coded entries. At first, the notebook looked like a secret. Letters, numbers, and marks seemed to point nowhere. In the atmosphere of 1970, it was easy to understand why people might look at it and think of espionage. Europe was still living under the long shadow of the Cold War. Norway was a NATO country, positioned in a sensitive region, and the idea of hidden movements, false names, and coded messages did not feel impossible. But the notebook did not prove she was a spy. What it proved was quieter. and maybe more unsettling. When investigators began to decode the entries, they appeared to reveal a pattern of travel, dates, places, and movements through different cities. The woman had not simply appeared in Bergen without a trace. She had moved through Norway and beyond in a way that seemed organized, careful, and difficult to explain. And once investigators followed those codes backward, the woman in the valley became many women at once. Hotel records and registration forms began to show that she had used multiple names. Some reports suggest she gave different nationalities or inconsistent personal details at different places. She had stayed in hotels, often paid in cash, and kept a certain distance from the people around her. Staff and witnesses who remembered her described a woman who was elegant and well-dressed, but also alert. She did not seem lost. She did not seem careless. She seemed like someone managing what others were allowed to know. The items in the suitcases added another layer. Wigs, clothing, and cosmetics suggested she had the ability to alter her appearance. On their own, those items did not prove anything unusual. Travelers carry extra clothes. People change their hair. People protect their privacy. But in this case, every ordinary explanation had to sit beside something harder to dismiss. The missing documents, the removed labels, the false names, the coded notebook, and the abandoned luggage. Each layer answered one question, then opened another. The scene in the valley showed that she had died without a clear identity. The suitcases showed that she had been traveling with objects connected to more than one version of herself. The notebook suggested that her movements had been recorded in a private system, and the hotel records suggested that the names she used were not names that led investigators back to a real life. Eventually, medical findings added another difficult piece. Her death was connected to carbon monoxide poisoning and sedatives, including barbiturates. At the time, authorities leaned toward a conclusion of suicide, but that explanation had one problem. It did not easily account for everything around it. Why remove labels from clothing? Why carry multiple identities? Why leave suitcases at a railway station? Why record travel in code? Why was no one, anywhere, able to step forward and say with certainty, "I know her"? The Cold War context made the spy theory especially tempting. According to some discussions of the case, her movements may have overlapped with areas of military or strategic interest. But that remains a theory, not a confirmed answer. The more responsible conclusion is also the more frustrating one. Investigators had signs of secrecy, but not enough proof to define what that secrecy meant. By the time police reconstructed parts of her journey, they knew more about where she had been, but still, almost nothing about who she was. The woman was eventually buried in Bergen under an unknown name. No family reclaimed her. No confirmed identity restored her place in the world. Over the years, the Isdal Woman became one of Norway's most famous mysteries, discussed by journalists, investigators, podcasters, and people far beyond Scandinavia. Decades later, modern forensic testing brought new clues. Analysis of her teeth and tissue suggested she may have been born around the early 1930s and may have had links to parts of Europe, such as Germany or the Franco-German border region. But even those clues did not give her a name, and that is why the case has lasted. It was not remembered only because it was strange. It was remembered because every answer seemed to leave the most important uncertainty untouched. Not just how she died, but why so much of her life had been made impossible to trace. What makes the Isdal Woman case so difficult to forget is not only the code, or the aliases, or the Cold War theories that gathered around her. It is the way a real person was reduced, piece by piece, into unanswered fragments: a suitcase, a hotel form, a removed label, a notebook that recorded movement, but not meaning. The smallest details became the most important ones. A missing tag on a piece of clothing might seem almost insignificant at first. But in this case, those missing labels became part of a larger pattern, a life carefully separated from the systems that usually help us recognize one another. Identity is not just a passport or a name written on paper. It is how the world confirms that someone was here, that someone knew them, that someone could speak for them when they no longer could. More than 50 years later, her movements have been traced, her belongings have been examined, and parts of her final journey have been reconstructed. But the central uncertainty remains. Who was she before the valley? And until that name is returned to her, the mystery remains personal. Not because it needs a more dramatic ending, but because beneath every theory, there was a woman whose life ended without recognition. The Isdal Woman case leaves us with the silence of a name missing from history. But she was not the only person whose identity seemed to vanish after death. Sometimes, the absence of a name is not just an investigative obstacle, it is the first sign that something deeper has gone wrong. Years before Isdalen, in a wooded area of Philadelphia, another unknown person was found in a place no one expected. File number 04E, the boy nobody could identify. In February of 1957, a cardboard box was found beside a quiet road in the Fox Chase section of Philadelphia. It was the kind of place people might pass without thinking. A wooded roadside, cold air, winter trees, and something left where it did not belong. Inside the box was a young child no one could name. For decades, he would be known only by the object and the place connected to him, the boy in the box. Later, another name would appear on his grave, America's unknown child. But neither of those names belonged to him. They were placeholders for a truth investigators could not reach. He was very young, only about 4 years old when he died. Long after the discovery, he would be identified as Joseph Augustus Zarelli, born on January 13, 1953. But in 1957, police did not know that. They did not know his home, his family, or why no one seemed to be searching for him. Their first task sounded simple: find out who this child was. But this was a different era of investigation. There was no modern DNA database, no instant digital network of missing persons records, no easy way to compare one unknown child against thousands of files across the country. Detectives depended on witnesses, newspaper coverage, posters, and the hope that someone, somewhere, would recognize him. That hope did not bring an answer for many years. No clear missing child report matched him. No relative came forward to claim him. And as the case spread through Philadelphia and beyond, the most basic question remained unanswered. How could a child disappear from the world so completely that no one could give him back his name? But before Joseph had a name, the case began with something much colder: a box, a roadside, and a city that could not explain where this child had come from. On February 25, 1957, the discovery near Susquehanna Road turned a quiet wooded area of Fox Chase into the center of a case Philadelphia would carry for generations. A young boy had been found inside a cardboard box left near the roadside. According to reports, the box was believed to have once held a baby bassinet from J.C. Penney. At first, it was just an object at the scene, something investigators could collect, examine, and trace. But over time, that box would become much more than evidence. It would become the image people remembered before they knew the child's name. Police quickly understood that this was not a routine identification case. The boy was very young. He had no papers with him, no item that clearly connected him to a home, and no adult nearby who could explain why he was there. Investigators determined that he had suffered neglect over time and had died from violence, but the details of who he was and who was responsible remained out of reach. In most cases involving a child, a name is one of the first things investigators know. In this case, it became the mystery that lasted for generations. The first search was simple in theory: find the family, find the missing child report, find someone who would recognize him. But no clear report matched. No parent or relative came forward. No neighbor, teacher, doctor, or caretaker immediately gave police the answer they needed. That absence changed the shape of the investigation. If a child is found and no one claims him, the question is no longer only what happened. It becomes something even more troubling. How could a child this young exist in the world, disappear from it, and leave behind so little that led back to a life? The police turned to the public. His image and identifying information were circulated. Newspapers covered the case. Posters and flyers were distributed. Investigators followed leads, listened to tips, and checked possibilities. Over the years, many theories would be considered, some involving mistaken identity, possible abduction, family secrets, or institutions connected to children. But none of those early paths produced enough evidence to say, with certainty, this is who he was. The box became the clue everyone remembered, but for decades, it also became the thing that replaced his name. Before he was Joseph Augustus Zarelli, he was a headline, a poster, a photograph, a question Philadelphia could not answer. People knew the phrase "boy in the box," but that phrase held a painful contradiction. It kept the case alive, but it also showed how far investigators still were from restoring his identity. And so the investigation moved forward, with 2 searches at once, one for the person who left him there, and one for the name the world had lost. For a while, the case stayed active through traditional police work. Detectives collected fingerprints, examined evidence from the scene, checked missing persons reports, and pursued tips from the public. But the limits of the era were difficult to escape. There was no modern DNA technology. There were no online ancestry databases. There was no quick way to connect an unknown child in Philadelphia to relatives who might have lived under different names, in different neighborhoods, or far from the original scene. As years passed, the case became a cold case, but it was never entirely abandoned. Different investigators returned to it. New generations of police and forensic specialists looked again at the same old question. The child was eventually buried with a marker that called him America's unknown child. It was a gesture of remembrance, but also an admission. The community had refused to forget him, but it still did not know who he was. Then, decades after the discovery, science began to offer something the original investigators never had. In 1998, his remains were exhumed, so investigators could try to obtain DNA evidence. Later, as technology improved, further efforts were made to collect better samples and apply newer forensic methods. For many cold cases, this is the moment when the past begins to move again. Not because the evidence changes, but because the tools used to read it become stronger. The turning point came through genetic genealogy. Investigators used DNA to trace biological relatives, first through one family line and then through another. Slowly, the unknown child was no longer only an unknown child. He was connected to real families, real records, and a real place in the world. Birth records and DNA comparisons eventually led investigators to his name. He was Joseph Augustus Zarelli, born on January 13, 1953. He had lived in West Philadelphia. He was about 4 years old when he died. For the first time in 65 years, the child in the box had a name. But the case still did not have an ending. When Philadelphia police publicly announced his identity on December 8, 2022, it answered the question that had haunted generations of investigators: who was he? But it did not answer the question that came immediately after: who caused his death, and why had no one reported him missing in a way that brought him home? The people believed to be his biological parents were no longer alive by the time his name was made public. Authorities also protected the privacy of living relatives, including siblings, which meant the public learned enough to restore Joseph's identity, but not enough to explain the full history around him. After his identification, the marker that once read, America's unknown child, no longer held the same meaning. Joseph was no longer only a symbol of an unsolved case. He was a specific child, with a birthday, a family line, and a name that had been missing from the story for more than 6 decades. But legally, the case remained unresolved. There was no public conviction. No one was formally held responsible in court. Police continued to treat the case as an open homicide investigation, hoping that the return of Joseph's name might still lead to someone, somewhere, offering the missing piece. The name Joseph Augustus Zarelli solved one mystery, but it also made the unanswered part of the case feel even heavier. Because once a child is no longer unknown, the question changes. It is no longer only, who was the boy in the box? It becomes, what happened to Joseph? What makes Joseph Augustus Zarelli's case so difficult to carry is that the answer came in 2 parts, separated by decades. Science could restore his name, his birthday, and part of his place in the world, but it could not, by itself, explain the silence that surrounded him. For years, the cardboard box was the image people remembered. It was the detail that made the case impossible to forget. But it also became the symbol that stood where a name should have been. When Joseph was finally identified, the story did not become easier. It became more human. He was no longer only America's unknown child. He was a child who had lived, belonged somewhere, and should have been protected. That is the painful weight of this case. A name can change how we remember a victim, but it does not automatically bring justice. DNA opened a door that had been closed for 65 years. Yet the final question still remains beyond it. Who took Joseph's life? And why did it take the world so long to know who he was? Joseph's case shows how silence can surround a life long before investigators ever arrive. But in the next story, The silence was not around one unknown child. It was around an entire family. In France, in 1999, a doctor, his wife, and their 2 young children became part of a mystery that began on land, drifted out to sea, and left behind clues no one could fully arrange. File number 04F, the family that disappeared into the sea. In September of 1999, a sailboat named Nick left the port of Saint-Malo on the northern coast of France. On board was Yves Godard, a French doctor, and his 2 young children, Camille and Marius. The trip was supposed to be short, a few days at sea, then a return to shore. But the boat did not come back. Instead, the sea began giving pieces of the story back slowly. Not all at once, not in a way that made sense. Objects connected to the family appeared in the water and along the coast, as if the case itself had been broken apart and scattered by the tide. At first, nothing about the situation had to seem sinister. Yves Godard was a father taking his children on a sailing trip. He had been working at his medical practice in Cannes shortly before leaving. He had rented the boat, given a return date, and set out from Saint-Malo in what could have been seen as an ordinary family outing. But there was one absence that would become impossible to ignore. Marie-France Godard, Yves' wife and the children's mother, was not on the boat, and after the family's disappearance, she too could not be found. That single detail changed the shape of everything. What first looked like a maritime disappearance began to stretch backward, away from the open water and toward the family's home in Normandy. The question was no longer only whether a boat had been lost at sea. It became whether the sea was the beginning of the tragedy, or only the place where someone hoped the truth would disappear. Was this an accident, a crime, or something planned before the boat ever left the harbor? At first, it looked like a short sailing trip, but within days, the trip became a disappearance, and the disappearance became a criminal investigation. On August 30th, 1999, Yves Godard was still seeing patients at his medical practice in Cannes. From the outside, nothing suggested that a family disappearance was about to unfold. He was a doctor and a father, with appointments and routines that seemed to belong to an ordinary life. But the next day, that pattern changed. On August 31st, according to reports, Yves canceled appointments, put parts of his work in order, and took his 2 young children, Camille and Marius, fishing. Camille was 6 years old, Marius was 4. The kind of detail that might have seemed normal at the time, a father spending time with his children, would later become part of a much darker timeline. Then, on September 1st, Yves rented a sailboat named Nick at the port of Saint-Malo. He said he would be going out for a few days with the children and returning on September 5th. The plan had a beginning, a destination, and a clear return date. But Marie-France Godard, Yves' wife, was not with them. At first, that absence could be explained in ordinary ways. Not every parent joins every short trip. Not every family outing includes the whole family. But after the boat failed to return, Marie-France's absence became one of the details investigators could no longer set aside. On September 2nd, French customs officers checked the boat at sea. Yves and the children were reportedly still on board. This mattered because it confirmed that the 3 of them had not simply vanished immediately after leaving the harbor. For at least part of the journey, the sailing trip had, at least for a time, actually begun. In the following days, witnesses reportedly saw the boat around the Brehec area. Then September 5 arrived, the date Yves was supposed to return. He did not. Neither did Camille. Neither did Marius. And the sailboat Nick did not come back to port. The first clue from the water was not the boat itself, but something smaller. A dinghy, connected to the sailboat, found adrift at sea. Inside were items reportedly linked to Yves, including a jacket and a checkbook. It was a signal, but not an explanation. A dinghy could suggest an accident. It could suggest an emergency. It could suggest that something had gone wrong quickly and without warning. But that explanation had one problem. The sea gave investigators their first clue. The house would give them the first reason to doubt the story. When authorities began looking into the disappearance, they examined Yves' van at Saint-Malo. According to public records, they found suspicious traces, including blood and morphine. That discovery shifted the case away from a simple maritime incident. A family could be lost at sea. A boat could sink. A storm or accident could explain silence from the water. But traces in a vehicle on land were harder to place inside that story. Then investigators searched the family home in Normandy. What they found there made the situation even more troubling. According to reports, multiple traces of blood were discovered in parts of the house. Later, blood found in the van was identified as belonging to Marie-France Godard. At that point, the case was no longer only about a missing father and 2 children at sea. It was about a woman who had not been on the boat, had not been seen in the public timeline, and whose blood had now become part of the investigation. Yves Godard became the main suspect in the direction investigators were following. But even that created a problem. The person investigators most needed to question had also vanished. He was not at home. He was not in custody. He was somewhere beyond the reach of a direct interview, beyond the reach of a confession, and beyond the reach of a clear reconstruction. This case did not unfold through one discovery. It unfolded through fragments: a dinghy, papers, cards, clothing, and later, remains. Every object brought back by the tide seemed to answer one question, while making the larger mystery harder to close. In the years after the disappearance, more items connected to the Godard family were found in different places along the coast or at sea. Reports mentioned documents, bank cards, personal belongings, life jackets, and survival equipment. Each find pulled the case back into public attention. Each one suggested that something from the missing boat or from the missing family had survived the sea long enough to drift back. But none of it brought back the whole story. The sailboat Nick was never found. Without it, investigators were missing what could have been the most important physical scene of all. The boat might have held signs of accident, violence, staging, or panic. It might have shown whether the family had tried to survive. It might have shown whether something happened on board after they left Saint-Malo. But the sea kept that part. Over time, the case became even more painful. Remains were later identified as connected to Camille. Then, in 2007, Reuters reported that bones identified as Yves Godard's had been found off the western coast of France. That discovery closed off one major theory. Yves had not simply escaped and started a new life somewhere else, but it did not close the case. Marie-France remained missing. Marius's exact fate remained one of the most difficult gaps in the public record. And even with Yves' remains identified, there was still no final account of what happened between the family home, the port of Saint-Malo, and the open sea. Investigators had a direction. Publicly, Yves remained the central figure in the investigators' leading theory. The theory that he may have killed his wife before leaving with the children became the most prominent explanation discussed around the case. But the law requires more than a theory that fits many facts. It requires proof strong enough to stand as an official conclusion, and that proof never fully arrived. In 2012, the case was closed, without anyone being prosecuted. The prosecutor in Saint-Malo stated that a simple maritime accident could be ruled out, but also that authorities could not officially prove the full sequence of events strongly enough to bring the case to trial. The likely direction of the investigation pointed toward Yves, but there was no conviction, no courtroom verdict, and no legal judgment that could confirm every part of the story. That is what makes the Godard family case so unsettling. It is not only that a family disappeared, it is that the evidence came back in pieces, never in the order needed to make a complete picture. The sea returned objects. It returned traces. It eventually returned part of Yves Godard. But it did not return the boat. It did not return Marie-France. It did not return a clear final moment for Camille and Marius. The file closed, but the story did not. It simply stopped at the edge of what could be proven. What makes the Godard family case so difficult to forget is not that it offers one clear answer, but that it never allowed the evidence to settle into a complete shape. There were traces on land, objects brought back by the tide, and discoveries that seemed to point in one direction. Yet every step forward still left something missing. The smallest detail, at first, was an absence. Marie-France was not on the boat. That absence changed everything. It forced investigators to look back from the water to the house, from the sailing trip to the days before it, from an apparent maritime disappearance to the possibility of something far more troubling. But possibility is not the same as proof, and that is where the case remains trapped. The sea returned some of the evidence, but never the whole truth. It returned fragments, not a final witness. It gave investigators pieces of a story, but not the order in which those pieces belonged. Marie-France, Camille, and Marius remain at the center of that silence. And that is why the case still feels unfinished, not as a puzzle to be solved neatly, but as a family tragedy that stopped at the edge of what could be proven. Across all three cases, the most unsettling pattern is not only the absence of answers, it is the way ordinary details became the foundation of everything that followed. A label cut from clothing, a cardboard box by a roadside, a wife who was not on a boat. None of those details explained the cases by themselves, but each one forced investigators to look again and to ask whether the first version of the story had been too simple. These mysteries are not just about evidence, they are about the limits of evidence. Investigators can collect objects, trace movements, test DNA, examine records, and rebuild timelines. But sometimes the most important piece is not physical. Sometimes it is a witness who never speaks, a document that never existed, a person who never came forward, or a final moment no one survived to explain. And in each story, identity matters, not as a detail in a file, but as the thing that keeps a person from becoming only a symbol. The Isdal Woman was more than a code. Joseph Augustus Zarelli was more than a headline. Marie-France, Camille, and Marius Godard were more than fragments returned by the tide. They were real people whose lives deserve more than theories. Maybe that is why stories like these stay with us. They remind us that mystery is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet. It hides in routine, in silence, in paperwork, in family life, in the places people pass without looking twice. And sometimes, even after decades of searching, the truth does not disappear because no one cared. Sometimes it remains out of reach because the final piece was lost too early, too far, or too completely to be recovered. Some cases end with answers, others end with a name, a question, or a shoreline that gives back only part of what it took. If you want more stories like this, consider subscribing. And as always, thank you for watching.
This file may be closed, but the truth is always out there. What do you think really happened? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to follow the next case. I'm Detective Frost, and this is the Cold Files.